Deuteronomy 2 through 3 this morning. I want to begin by reading to you Psalm 135. One of the things that's really important is sometimes we find the Psalms recounting events in the Old Testament, and those can give us kind of an interesting sort of theological angle on those events. So Psalm 135 actually is an account of an event that we're going to read about in just a minute. So here it is. Praise the Lord. Praise the Lord, the name of the Lord. Give praise, O servants of the Lord, who stand in the house of the Lord, in the courts of the house of our God. Praise the Lord, for the Lord is good. Sing to his name, for it is pleasant. For the Lord has chosen Jacob for himself, Israel for his own possession. For I know that the Lord is great, and that our Lord is above all gods. Whatever the Lord pleases, he does, in heaven and on earth, in the seas and in all deeps. He it is who makes the clouds rise at the end of the earth, who makes lightnings for the rain, who brings forth the wind from his storehouses. He it is who struck the firstborn of Egypt, both man and beast, who in your midst, O Egypt, sent signs and wonders against Pharaoh and all his servants, who struck down many nations and killed many mighty kings, Sihon the king of the Amorites, Og the king of Bashan, and all the kingdoms of Canaan, and gave their land as a heritage to his people Israel. Your name, O Lord, endures forever. Your renown, O Lord, throughout all ages. For the Lord will vindicate his people and have compassion on his servants. Now, this is a very compressed account of the conquest of the Promised Land, which we're going to be starting to read about this morning, especially the defeat of the King Og and King Sihon of the Amorites. But notice the context in which Psalm 135 places all this. It begins by celebrating God as the creator of all that is, and then it places everything that God's done from the Exodus in Egypt to the settlement of the Promised Land and the conquest or the settling in the land of Canaan as the work of God who is the creator. Okay, so this is like really, really important. This means that the account of the settlement of the land of Canaan is not a heroic account of Israel's military might or greatness. And I think that's a really, really important thing to emphasize, right? The story of the conquest of the land is not a story about a brave people who, strong in heart, anxious for conquest, bravely march into a new land and displace all the people who are there. Hurrah, 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 go us. That's not the narrative here. The narrative here is that Israel's being settled in the Promised Land is finally and fundamentally an action of God for which the people of Israel can take no credit whatsoever. So it was a really important point here as we make that journey. So let's begin by taking a look at what happens starting in the second chapter of Deuteronomy. Now, like we find in many places in Deuteronomy, this is a kind of retelling of an event that we've already read about, but Deuteronomy wants to put its own kind of particular interpretation on that event. And in this case, this is the story of Israel's journey from Kadesh Barnea down to the Red Sea and then up into the land that's called the Transjordan, this land that's to the east of the Jordan River before you cross over into Israel proper. So we have a retelling of that story, and much in Deuteronomy actually is a retelling of things that we've already seen, both in Exodus and also Numbers. But now we're getting it from a slightly different perspective. So here's the story, or here's the beginning of the story, and I'll say a few things about it. And it's really important to notice that along the way, and this is sort of Deuteronomy's habit, right? Deuteronomy will sort of tell a narrative, and then there'll be this important like theological note that will be introduced. So here it is. Then we turned and journeyed into the wilderness. So this is after crossing the Red Sea. Then we turned and journeyed in the wilderness in the direction of the Red Sea, as the Lord told me, and for many days we traveled around Mount Seir. Then the Lord said to me, "You have been traveling around this mountain country long enough. Turn northward and command the people, you are about to pass through territory of your brother, the people of Esau, who live in Seir, and they will be afraid of you. So be very careful. Do not contend with them, or for I will not give you any of their land, not so much as the sole for a foot to tread on, because I have given Mount Seir to Esau as a possession. You shall purchase food from them with money that you may eat, and you may also buy water with them for money that you may drink. For the Lord your God," and here's the theological note, "for the Lord your God has blessed you in all the work of your hands. He knows you're going through this great wilderness. These 40 years, the Lord your God has been with you. You have lacked nothing." So notice what's going on here. We're being told now that as the people have made this journey, right, across the Red Sea, through the wilderness, now they're coming up into the Transjordan. There's this important theological note that reminds the people of Israel of two things. First, the Lord has blessed them, and this blessing has occurred to them despite their rebellion and despite their ingratitude. God has still blessed them. So once again, here we have the Old Testament's doctrine of grace, which basically means something like this. God does not respond to us simply in the way that we respond to him, which is a really good thing, okay? In other words, one of the things that the doctrine of grace means is that we don't get what we deserve, which is really nice. So God's reminding the people that he's blessed them through their journey. And then he says this, you know, this journey has been going on now for 40 years, and you have lacked nothing. In a couple chapters, when the people of Israel actually crossed the Jordan River, we'll read about the day that the manna stopped. So we'll read about the fact the manna doesn't stop until the people actually begin to eat the produce of the land. But notice that for 40 years, right, they've been sustained by manna and also by miraculous water. Okay, so they've been sustained by God. And once again, the idea here is that the journey's been made possible by God. Now, the second really important note is this. So as they come up into the Transjordan, the first land that they come to is the land of Edom. So southeast of the Jordan River. And notice they're told that they are not to conquer this land. It's not theirs. It's not going to be given to them for a really important reason. This is the land that's been given to Esau and his descendants. And of course, we remember, right? Esau was Jacob's brother. So really important note here, right? Notice here, and we'll see this again in just a minute, Esau is a descendant of Abraham. Although he is not chosen, although he's not the covenant people, nevertheless, he's still blessed, and he's settled in land, right? This is sort of like a little hint to the people of Israel, okay? Why aren't you conquering the land of Edom? Because it's been settled by Esau, the brother of Jacob, your father, right? God's blessed him because he is Jacob's brother. He's been given this land. And so guess what? If God actually blesses someone who's not directly related to him by covenant, imagine what he's going to do for his covenant people. That's the message here, right? So they're told here that they're not to conquer the land of Edom. They need to sort of keep heading north along the Transjordan. And then the next thing that happens is that they come to another place, and this is Deuteronomy 2, 8 and following. And we turned and went in the direction of the wilderness of Moab. So Moab is the land immediately north of Edom. So now they've crossed over into Moab. And once again, and the Lord said to me, do not harass Moab or contend with them in battle, for I will not give you any of their land for a possession, because I have given Ar to the people of Lot as a possession. So notice here, now we're talking about, this is Abraham's nephew, remember? Okay, so the Lot and his descendants have been settled in Moab, this area immediately north of Edom. So you're not to conquer that either, because we have yet another descendant of Abraham whose descendants have been settled in this land, and they're staying there. So move on. Okay, really interesting point, right? So now they travel through the land that belongs to sort of two of their relations, Esau and Lot, on their way north. Once again, I think that's really important. And then here's a really important note in Deuteronomy 2:14. So they're heading up now north in the Transjordan, and then this note. And the time from our leaving Kadesh Barnea until we crossed the brook of Zered was 38 years, until the entire generation, that is the men of war, had perished from the camp as the Lord had sworn to them. For indeed the hand of the Lord was against them to destroy them from the camp, and they perished. So we're told here once again, right, there's a reminder that there's been a reason for this time in the wilderness, and it's time to allow the rebellious Exodus generation to die off. They are not to enter the promised land. This Israel's journey to the promised land has been intentionally prolonged to allow this generation to die off so that they don't enter into the promised land. This will actually be important for something that we see later on, because the first thing that Joshua is going to do as he leads the people in the promised land is they're going to actually do two things. They're going to circumcise all the men who were not circumcised in the wilderness, and they're going to celebrate the Passover. So I'll say more about that. But you notice here, in effect, right, what God has intentionally done is he's in effect constructed things so that Israel, in effect, is remade. And we'll see this emphasis as we move on. They're now heading north, and okay, don't conquer this land, don't conquer this land, don't conquer this land, and then finally something happened. So this is Deuteronomy 2:24. Here we have the conquest of Sihon, the king of the Amorites, and I'll just read you the account. So here's what God tells the people: rise up, set out on your journey, and go to the valley of the Arnon. Behold, I have given into your hand Sihon, the king of the Amorite, the king of Heshbon, and his land. Begin to take possession and contend with him in battle. This day I will begin to put dread and fear of you on the peoples who are under the whole heaven, and who shall hear the report of you and tremble and be in anguish because of you. So really important contrast here. Something that we want to kind of note here, which is also an important theological note. The people of Israel here are invited, commanded really, to fear God, because in fearing God, they will not fear any human adversaries. So this is like almost like an important principle, right? In fearing God, in holding God in awe, respect, admiration, all those sorts of things, right? In fearing God, they will then not fear human adversaries. And as we've seen, right, they have a tendency to do this. They have a tendency to not fear God and to fear human adversaries. That's kind of how that kind of works out. But notice here, the idea here is okay, well, don't be afraid. So we just want to kind of remember what's going on here, right? This is a band of escaped slaves who have been wandering in the midst of nowhere for the last 40 years. They're approaching the kingdom of the Ammonites, ruled over by Sihon. And the kingdom of the Ammonites is essentially an urban kingdom. It's a kingdom of walled cities. And so, right, this is going to be the kind of thing that's going to sort of strike fear into their hearts. Okay? They're relatively unsophisticated. So they're coming up to these walled cities, right, which are heavily sophisticated sort of urban centers of cities with these massive walls around them. And they're being told, right, before this all happens, look, I'm giving this whole land into your hand. As long as you fear me, you won't fear them. Okay? And so this is what happens. So here's the account of the defeat of King Sihon of the Amorites. This is Deuteronomy 2:26 and following. So I sent messengers from the wilderness of Kedemoth to Sihon the king of Heshbon, and words of peace, saying, let me pass through your land. I will only go by the road, and I will not turn either to the left nor to the right. You shall sell me food for money, that I may eat, and give water for money, that I may drink. Only let me pass through on foot, as the sons of Esau live in Seir, and the Moabites who live in the Ar did for me, until I go over the Jordan into the land that the Lord our God is giving us. But Sihon, the king of Heshbon, would not let us pass by him. For the Lord your God hardened his spirit and made his heart obstinate, that he might give him into your hand as he is this day. And the Lord said, behold, I have begun to give Sihon and his land over to you. Begin to take possession, that you may occupy his land. Then Sihon came out against us, he and his people, to battle at Jahaz. And the Lord our God gave him over to us, and we defeated him and his sons and all his people, and we captured all his cities at that time, and devoted to destruction every city, men, women, and children. We left no survivors. Let's take a look at what's going on there. So here we have Moses here tells us that he kind of sends this kind of standard request for passage through somebody's land, right? So you're coming into somebody's land, and you write to the king and you say, dear king, we're going to journey through your land on foot. We don't mean you any harm. We're happy to buy any food that we need. We're happy to buy any water, but we're going to just pass through your land on our way to somewhere else. Please allow us to do that. And Sihon basically says, no way, and sends out his army to prevent this from happening. Now, it's interesting here, right, that we're told that Sihon's heart was hardened. Now, we remember this, right, from the story of the Exodus, right, where Pharaoh's heart was hardened. And so we might want to just say a little bit about what this means, right? So the idea here is not that, Sihon was a really generous guy who, in his heart of hearts was going to say, yes, please, come through my land. We're happy to supply you with anything you need, and we've got like really great hotels here and, some great tourist sites. Spend as long as you want here. We're happy to see you. And then somehow like God, made him do something different. That's not the idea. Rather, the idea here is that in effect, right, the hardening is God sort of takes Sihon's kind of pride and arrogance and sort of like magnifies it So that, what he does is, he's doing it, right? But he's acting out of his own pride and arrogance and sort of like self-conceit. And that's actually sort of like his downfall, right? There's an idea, there's sort of like an idea here, right? That the problem with certain leaders, right, is that their own arrogance, in effect, results in their own downfall. Because they can't come to that moment where they are able to see their policies as like mistaken in some fundamental way. And Sihon is sort of an example of that. Now we also have this note here that the populations of all these cities are devoted to destruction. I want to say a little bit word about that because that's an important thing as well. Now what does that mean? Now in a normal military campaign, right, in the ancient world, what would happen is that, if you conquered someone else, what you would do is you would kind of round up all the people and you would sell them into slavery. And so we just want to note here, right, that armies in the ancient world kind of worked fundamentally differently than they do in the modern world. In the ancient world, armies in effect were sort of revenue sources, right? You went out and conquered someone, sold their stuff into slavery, plundered the place, took the gold and silver, and you were making money. War was a way of making money. The thing that's made clear here is that that's not what this is. Israel is not allowed to round up the survivors and sell them into slavery. Rather, they're all devoted to destruction. In effect, they're all sort of like given over to God in acknowledgement of the fact that actually the victory belongs to God and not to Israel. Now, what's going on here? I think another thing that's going on here that we just want to notice here is it's the question of, well, what's the wrong with like the inhabitants of this land, right? They're sometimes collectively called the Canaanites, although that's kind of like an umbrella term. What's going on here? The settlement of the land, and this will be true throughout the whole book of Joshua, the settlement of the land here is viewed as a judgment upon the people who are settled in it. It's a judgment essentially on their civilization, but also on the religion that animates that civilization. So the peoples who sort of inhabit Canaan, right, worship various Canaanite gods. Much of these gods have to do with fertility, and there are all kinds of kind of odd practices that are associated with the worship of these gods. One of which, and if you read in the Old Testament, you'll sort of be familiar with this, right? One of which is the practice of what's called sacred prostitution. So there'd be like a temple to a certain god. Think about the goddess Astarte, who was a sort of female deity. And then attached to Astarte's temple, there would in effect be sort of like a sort of glorified brothel. And the idea is that by coming in to sort of have contact with these prostitutes, which by the way were both male and female, you were sort of receiving some of the benefit of Astarte's fertility gift. So this is a huge thing. The other thing that's going on here, obviously, too, is the practice of child sacrifice is widespread in the land of Canaan. The idea, right, once again, you give up what is something valuable to you, and this is a way of showing the God that you really value that God or goddess. And so what would often happen is they'd have these huge like pits of fire, and you just take your child and toss them in. And this showed, right, that you really thought that a particular god or goddess was like really important, and so you'd get blessed by that god or goddess. Anyway, in effect, what we're seeing here, I think, in the conquest of the land or the settlement of the land, is God's sort of judgment on this whole sort of civilization and the religion upon which it's based. More about that later. Now, I think we do want to stop here and note something really important. And that is that what we find as time goes on is we find that beginning in the Old Testament, and then certainly by the time we get to the New Testament, we have kind of like a reconfiguration of the whole idea of battle, or who the enemy is. So one of the things we'll watch is as the Old Testament wears on, and then by the time we get to the New Testament, right, we'll get the idea that actually the sort of real enemy out there is not some human force, some human culture, some human civilization, but rather, to quote Paul's language in Ephesians 6, right, that the real enemy out there are powers, principalities, and the spiritual powers of darkness. That's the real opposition. I think you see this in a really powerful way in the 18th chapter of the Gospel of John, where this is Jesus' trial before Pontius Pilate. And remember here, it's important, right? So Jesus Christ means Jesus Messiah, or Anointed One, which, in our parlance is King Jesus. Okay, so Jesus is on trial before Pontius Pilate. He's standing there before Pontius Pilate, and Jesus, in effect, has a name tag that says, Jesus, King. And so Pilate says, are you a king? The hint, of course, here is, the answer darn well better be no, or, you're toast. And Jesus says something really interesting. He says, yes, I'm a king, but my kingdom is not from this world. If it were, my followers would be, in effect, at this moment, engaged in a battle to set me free. I think that's a really important moment, right? Jesus, in effect, telling Pontius Pilate, yes, I'm a king, but I'm not a king in the way that you understand it. In that my kingdom doesn't come from this world. It's not a political or military structure that someone sort of could create. Rather, it's not from this world, it's from beyond it. My kingdom comes from God. If I simply were another sort of messianic pretender, my followers would be at this minute fighting to get me free. And of course, we've actually already seen that a little bit. Remember what happens in the Garden of Gethsemane when Jesus is arrested. Good old Peter pulls out his sword and says, don't worry, Jesus, I'll protect you. It's kind of, it's actually humorous, right? You've got this troop of temple police and some others, right, with clubs and spears and whatnot, and Peter's gonna, Peter's a superhero who's gonna fight them all off. Well, that's obviously not going to work. Now, another thing we want to notice here very quickly is something that happens in Deuteronomy 3. And that is, here we have the beginning of the settlement of the land. This is Deuteronomy 3:12. So we're still in Transjordan, and now we're going to see that we're going to get 3 tribes that are going to be settled in that land. So here it is. When we took possession of this land at that time, I gave it to the Reubenites and the Gadites, the territory beginning at Er, which is on the edge of the valley of the Arnon, and half of the hill country of Gilead and its cities. The rest of Gilead and all Bashan, that is, now we're moving still northward, the rest of Gilead and its cities, the rest of Gilead and all Bashan, the kingdom of Og and all that is in the region of Argob, I gave to the half-tribe of Manasseh. So we haven't entered the promised land yet, but rather we've got now 2 tribes and a half-tribe settled in the Transjordan to the east, right? So we've got Gad, we've got Reuben, and we've got the half-tribe of Manasseh who are settled now and who will kind of stay there, although only temporarily, because Moses is going to ask them, or actually compel them, to cross over the Jordan River to help with the conquest of the land. And then when that's done, they're going to be allowed to return back across to the other side. Now, one other thing here that we want to notice here, this is Deuteronomy 3:18 and following. This is what Moses says to these three tribes. And I commanded you at that time, saying, the Lord your God has given you this land to possess. So they're there. And all your men of valor shall cross over armed before your brothers, the people of Israel. Only your wives and your little ones and your livestock, I know that you have much livestock, shall remain in the cities that I have given you, until the Lord gives rest to your brothers and to you, and they occupy the land that the Lord your God gives them beyond the Jordan. I just want to say here a word here about this really important word, rest. It may not seem like a really important word, but actually it's a very theologically important word. So the term or the idea of rest here has sort of two senses. One sense is the sense that the Old Testament gives it. Rest here is that settlement in the land where Israel is sort of free from outside interference. Okay? Rest is peace, it's security, it's the ability of Israel to carry out her covenant with God. And that's the purpose of the land. The purpose of the land is to be a place of rest. And so when Israel settles into the land, she in effect enters into God's rest. Now, in the New Testament, we get a slightly different idea of this. It's not let go, but rather it is kind of refined. And so here it is. I want to read to you this from Hebrews chapter 4. So Hebrews here is commenting on the rest that Israel had in the land, and then it kind of sets out a new understanding of rest. This is Hebrews 4, 6 through 8, or 6 through 9. Since therefore it remains for some to enter it, and those who formerly received the good news failed to enter because of disobedience, again he appoints a certain day. Today, saying, through David and so long afterward, in the words already quoted, today if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. For if Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken of another day later on. So then there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For whoever has entered God's rest has also rested from his work as God did from his. So notice what's going on here. We have a larger notion of rest that's being introduced now in the New Testament. Rest number one in the Old Testament is settlement in the land, peaceful circumstances, protection from outside enemies, ability to live into the covenant. Rest number two in the New Testament, creation freed from sin and death. That's the rest that is to be entered into. Okay, so notice here, the rest here that Israel enjoys points forward to a larger rest that is to be enjoyed by the whole of creation. The whole of creation is to enter into the rest, the peace, the shalom of God. Okay, so, but that's on the way. That's something in the future. Okay, let's stop there. Next we'll pick it up here with Deuteronomy 3:23, and we'll get a foretaste of the death of Moses, which dramatically actually doesn't even occur until the last chapter. It kind of like, stay tuned for the death of Moses, stay tuned, stay tuned, stay tuned, and it comes finally in the last chapter.